Quick disclaimer, information in this podcast is for general informational purposes only and is not intended to be treated as medical advice. Always consult with your healthcare team before making changes to your diet, lifestyle, supplementation, or medication.
Normal blood sugar and A1C aren't based on opinion. They are defined by decades of medical science. Yet so many people still get it wrong, or worse, misled about the numbers. Today we'll explore exactly what the research says, what normal blood sugar levels actually are, and why it matters.
Welcome to Type 2 Diabetes Talk, the place where we chat about what really works to treat type 2 diabetes and prediabetes naturally with nutrition and lifestyle. If you're looking to optimize blood sugar and A1C, lose weight, reduce medications, and improve your overall health, this is the place to be. Now, here's your host, Type 2 Diabetes Nutrition Specialist, Dr. Jedha.
Hello, wonderful people. Dr. Jedha here, and welcome to episode 127. When I posted a short video on TikTok about normal blood sugar, I did not expect the firestorm of comments I received. Some asked questions because they still had confusion. Some pushed back hard and argued I was wrong. Some said their doctor told them something different. Others claimed it was a conspiracy with Big Pharma lowering the numbers for profit. Let me tell you, it was all very interesting. Before we get into all of this though, I want to say a few thank yous. Firstly, to those of you who left a 5-star rating on Apple, a big thank you to you. While you didn't leave any review comment, I appreciate your 5-star ratings. Similarly, a big thank you for leaving a rating on Spotify. All of these ratings really help the podcast, so I appreciate your support. And a special thanks to those who have left ratings and reviews on our website. Donna, who shared that the podcast helped her lose 25 pounds. That's awesome, Donna. Well done, and I'm so glad it's helped you get results. Bill, who shared that he was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes just over a year ago and said he used the information from the show and after about 15 months got his A1C down to 5.4, crediting the show for helping him get there. Thanks, Bill. That's wonderful to hear you've reversed the trajectory of your health so early in your diagnosis and now have a handle on things. Jackie, who said the podcast is so worth it. She said, I'm going through the podcast for a second time, listening to ones I skipped over or reviewing ones I want more information. I do this while exercising. Well worth the listen. Thanks, Jackie. So glad you love the podcast. I really appreciate that you've all taken the time to show your support by leaving a 5-star rating and or review. And if you're a regular listener, please head to type2diabetestalk.com/review to show your support for the podcast by leaving a 5-star rating and review. It really does help, and I love hearing from you, so I really appreciate it. Back to today's topic. Clearly there is a lot of confusion out there about normal blood sugar and A1C levels, and this matters. Knowing what's truly normal is the difference between protecting your long-term health or missing the warning signs. We have talked about numbers on the podcast before. In episode 11, we talked specifically about normal levels. Episode 60, we recap numbers and why blood sugar is so important. In episode 86, we talked about diagnostic criteria covering normal levels and when a diagnosis of prediabetes or type 2 diabetes is made. And across many other episodes, we have covered various numbers, but it's never a bad thing to take a refresher. If newly diagnosed, it helps explain the numbers, but even if you've been living with type 2 diabetes or prediabetes for a while, it's still important to take a refresher and have these normal numbers clear in your mind as a goal you might work toward. And as I said, when I posted this video on TikTok, there was so many comments, and it's very clear that there's still confusion around the numbers. So together today, we're going to go over the numbers, clear up the myths, explain what the science actually says, and answer your real questions about what normal blood sugar and A1C really is. Or actually, we're dividing these in part 1, part 2, because there is quite a lot to cover. So this is part 1, and then we'll publish a part 2 very soon. But before we get into any myths and conceptions, let's make sure we're all talking about the same thing. One of the biggest problems I saw in those TikTok comments was that people were using completely different definitions of the word normal. Some were talking about treatment targets for people living with diabetes. Others were talking about what's considered normal in someone without diabetes. And those are two very different things. So let's start with the basics. There are 3 numbers I want you to know. The first is your fasting blood sugar. This is the blood sugar level you measure first thing in the morning before you've eaten or had anything to drink apart from water. And ideally before you've done much activity at all. Literally, when you get up first thing in the morning, you take your fasting blood sugar. And of course, you can measure this at home using a finger prick glucose meter or a continuous glucose monitor, and you can also have this measured with a laboratory blood test as well. A normal fasting blood sugar is between 70 and 99 milligrams per deciliter or 4.0 to 5.5 millimoles per litre. Now, depending on where you live, you may also see some guidelines use up to 6.0 millimoles per litre as the upper limit of normal. I'll explain those differences shortly, but just be aware that different countries may use slightly different cutoffs. The second number is your post-meal or postprandial blood sugar. This is your blood sugar measured 2 hours after you start eating a meal. Again, you can measure this at home with a glucose meter or CGM. A normal 2-hour blood sugar is below 140 milligrams per deciliter. So 139 would be considered normal, below 140 milligrams per deciliter, or below 7.8 millimoles per litre. So 7.7 would be considered normal. The third measurement is your hemoglobin A1C or HbA1c, often simply called A1C. Unlike a finger prick test, this is a laboratory blood test. And rather than telling you what your blood sugar is right now, it estimates your average blood sugar over the past few months. A normal A1C is below 5.7% or below 39 millimoles per mole. So some countries use different measurements. They relate to the same thing. In some countries, you'll occasionally hear people refer to under 6% or under 42 as being normal or ideal. But internationally, an A1C below 5.7 is generally considered the threshold for normal glucose regulation. Now, I want to make one really important point. These numbers come from people without diabetes. They represent normal human physiology. For people living with prediabetes or type 2 diabetes, these are the numbers we ultimately want to move toward if they can be safely achieved. That doesn't mean everyone gets there overnight, and it doesn't mean everyone's treatment plan is identical, but these are the normal ranges that research has consistently associated with the lowest long-term health risks. And just a quick note before we continue, I'm talking here about adults who are not pregnant. Blood sugar targets during pregnancy and gestational diabetes are different, and that's a separate topic which we're not going to cover in this podcast. So what happens when your numbers are above these normal ranges? This is where we move into the diagnostic criteria for prediabetes and type 2 diabetes. And we did a whole podcast on this in episode 86. But let's briefly recap. For fasting blood sugar, prediabetes is generally diagnosed between 100 and 125 milligrams per deciliter or 5.6 to 6.9 millimoles per litre. A fasting blood sugar of 126 or 7.0 or higher is consistent with a type 2 diabetes diagnosis when confirmed appropriately. For your 2-hour post-meal blood sugar, prediabetes falls between 140 and 199, or 7.8 to 11.0. And a reading of 200 or 11.1 or higher is in the diabetes range. And for HbA1c, prediabetes is diagnosed at 5.7 to 6.4% or 39 to 47 millimoles per mole, and an A1C of 6.5% or 48 millimoles per mole or higher is consistent with a type 2 diabetes diagnosis. So those are the numbers. They're not my opinion, they're not social media opinions, and they're not something that changes depending on who you ask. These ranges have been established through decades of medical research and are used around the world to diagnose diabetes and estimate future health risk. Where the confusion begins is that treatment goals for someone already living with diabetes are sometimes very different from what's considered physiologically normal. And that's exactly where those TikTok comments went off the rails.
Are you ready to take charge of your diabetes health? Dr. Jedha's T2 diet program has been clinically proven in a randomized controlled trial to dramatically reduce A1C, weight, and medications in just 16 weeks. The T2 diet program will guide you step by step to discover an eating plan that feels natural and sustainable for you, and most importantly, works to get results. Learn more and join the program today at type2diabetestalk.com/programs.
So let's move on to unpacking some of the misconceptions and confusion that was raised on TikTok. Eric, John, Matt, and quite a few others were convinced I was wrong. They all made slightly different arguments, but the message was essentially the same, that a normal blood sugar after eating can be anywhere from 70 to 180 or 4 to 10.0, and that as long as you're somewhere within that range, you're healthy, or that it simply depends on the individual. And I completely understand why so many people believe that, because it's what many people living with type 2 diabetes have been told. Here's where the confusion comes in. A blood sugar up to 180 or 10.0 is often quoted as an acceptable treatment target for some people with diabetes. It is not the definition of a normal blood sugar. Those are two very different things. Treatment targets are often designed to be realistic and safe, taking into account factors such as age, medications, risk of hypoglycemia, that's low blood sugar, and other health conditions. They're not intended to redefine what normal human physiology looks like. And there's another important point. Even as a treatment target, 180 or 10 isn't necessarily where we want someone to stay long term if they can safely achieve better blood sugar control. The evidence shows that for most people, bringing blood sugar as close to possible to the normal range reduces the risk of complications. Now, you'll see the 180 or 10 target referenced in medical care guidelines, by diabetes organisations, and by many healthcare professionals. So let's have a look at what those guidelines actually say, because when you read them carefully, they tell a more complex story than many people realise. So let's start with the American Diabetes Association, or ADA. They've been publishing the standards of care in diabetes for decades, and many diabetes organisations around the world base their own recommendations on these guidelines. For most adults with type 2 diabetes, the ADA recommends aiming for a HbA1c below 7% or 53 millimoles per mole. They also recommend keeping your blood sugar below 180 or 10 2 hours after eating. Now, on the surface, those numbers seem straightforward, but there's something interesting when you look a little deeper. Elsewhere in the ADA guidelines, they include a table showing the relationship between average blood sugar and HbA1c. And this is where things become really important. If your average blood sugar were around 180 or 10, your estimated A1C would actually be around 8%, not under 7%. So if your goal is to achieve an A1C below 7%, your average glucose needs to be much lower, around 154 or 8.6. And if you're aiming for an A1C in the normal range, somewhere in the 5 range or close to 6%, your average blood sugar needs to be lower again, around 126 or 7.0. This is why it's so important not to confuse a maximum treatment target with an ideal blood sugar level. They're not the same thing. A post-meal reading of 180 or 10 might be a good starting place, but it's not what the evidence suggests you should routinely aim for if your goal is to achieve the lowest possible A1C and reduce your long-term risk of complications. In fact, the ADA themselves discuss this. They highlight landmark studies including the Kumamoto study and the UK Prospective Diabetes study, which found that lowering A1C even further, from 7% down to 6%, or 53 to 42 millimoles per mole, was associated with additional reductions in the risk of microvascular complications, including damage to the eyes, kidneys, and nerves. In other words, the evidence consistently shows that when it can be safely achieved, lower is generally better. The ADA also reinforced this in their 2021 International Consensus Report on Type 2 Diabetes Remission. They defined remission as maintaining an A1C below 6.5% or 48 millimoles per mole for at least 3 months without any glucose-lowering medication. Notice they didn't define remission as staying under 180 or 10 after meals. The focus is on bringing overall glucose control back toward the non-diabetes range. We talked about type 2 diabetes remission in detail in episode 24. Now, let's compare that with another major organisation, the American Association of Clinical Endocrinology, or AACE. Their recommendations are a little different. Rather than simply recommending an A1C below 7%, AACE states that the optimal HbA1c target is below 6.5% or 48 millimoles per mole, and as close to normal as is safe and achievable. I really like that wording because it acknowledges two important things. First, that everyone's situation is different and targets should always be individualised. But second, if someone can safely achieve blood sugar levels closer to the normal range, that should always be the goal. AACE also explains what blood sugar levels are generally needed to reach that A1C target. They state that achieving an A1C below 6.5% may require a fasting blood sugar below 110 or 6.1 and a 2-hour post-meal blood sugar below 140 or 7.8. Notice that's quite different from simply saying that anything under 180 or 10 is fine after meals. And it lines up perfectly with what we just saw in the ADA's own average glucose data. If your goal is a healthier A1C, your day-to-day blood sugar generally needs to stay much closer to the normal range than to 180 or 10 after meals. AACE also explains why these targets matter. They state that the impact of tight glycemic control for the prevention and or decreased progression of complications of type 2 diabetes is well established. In other words, this isn't about chasing perfect numbers for the sake of it. It's about reducing your risk of complications over the long term. Once again, we see the same consistent message. When it can be achieved safely, bringing blood sugar closer to the normal range offers greater protection against the complications of diabetes. And that's why we always recommend our members achieve as close to normal as they possibly can. Before we move on to consider some more evidence, let's hear a testimonial from one of our members.
Karen said, After joining DMP, I was able to get my A1C down from 8.1 to 6.4 in a matter of a few months and lost 15 pounds. My fasting blood sugars were ranging from 150 to 180, and now they are between 90 to 130. The wealth of educational material has been a game changer for me, and the food is creative and delicious. Thank you for making my lifestyle change enjoyable and doable, and giving me a renewed way of living with diabetes in a positive way.
Protection against the complications of diabetes isn't a new idea. We've had a strong evidence for decades showing that lowering HbA1c reduces the risk of diabetes complications. Now, one of the landmark studies was published by Stratton and colleagues in 2000, using data from the UK prospective diabetes studies, and the findings were pretty remarkable. For every 1% reduction in A1C, the risk of diabetes-related death fell by 21%, the risk of heart attack fell by 14%, and the risk of microvascular complications, that's damage to the eyes, kidneys and nerves, fell by 37%. Just think about that for a moment. Dropping your A1C from 8 to 7% or from 7 to 6% isn't just improving a number on a pathology report, it's associated with meaningful reductions in the risk of serious long-term health complications. That's why organisations like the ADA and AACE place so much emphasis on improving blood sugar control, and that's what this podcast is all about too, because we want you to be in the best health possible and protect your long-term health as well. There's also some interesting observational research that looked at the relationship between HbA1c and cardiovascular outcomes in people with type 2 diabetes. The researchers found that the lowest risk of heart attack occurred in people with A1C levels between 5.4 and 6.0. For stroke, the lowest risk was seen between 5.7 and 6.5. They also found that people with HbA1c levels between 7 and 7.4% had a 13% higher risk of heart attack and an 8% higher risk of stroke compared with those whose A1C was below 7%. Again, we see the same pattern emerging. The closer blood sugar is to the normal range, the lower the risk of complications. Now, does everyone need to achieve an HbA1c in the 5% range? No. Of course, there are always individual factors to consider, including age, other medical conditions, medications, the risk of hypoglycemia. But if you're able to safely lower your HbA1c, which is the case for most people, then the evidence consistently shows that doing so is associated with better long-term outcomes. And this brings us back to the original claim that a post-meal blood sugar of 180 or 10 is somehow normal. It isn't. It's a treatment ceiling used in some diabetes guidelines, not a definition of normal blood sugar levels, and not necessarily the level that will help most people achieve the healthiest possible A1C. If your goal is to reduce your long-term risk of complications, the evidence we've looked at today points in the same direction. Aim for blood sugar levels as close to the normal range as possibly can be achieved safely and sustainably. So, we've established what normal blood sugar actually is, based on evidence, not opinion, and we've seen that bringing blood sugar closer to normal, when it can be safely achieved, is associated with better long-term health. But there are still a lot of questions left unanswered. What if you're living with prediabetes? Should your targets be different? What if you're insulin resistant? What if normal numbers make you feel shaky? What about your age? Do levels change with aging? And what about all those comments saying everyone's normal is different? That's exactly what we're going to tackle in part 2 of this discussion, so stay tuned for that. But I hope you found today's episode insightful. For now, take care. Dr. Jedha, over and out.
Thanks for tuning in to Type 2 Diabetes Talk. Please subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast platform. And for episode replays, episode notes, and more, visit type2diabetestalk.com. New episodes are available Tuesdays, 10 a.m. U.S. Eastern Time, or your time zone equivalent. Thanks again. We're truly grateful to be a part of your life and help make a real difference.